I've got you. It was a warm summer day on the Johnson's farm, and Mr. Johnson decided it would be the perfect time to set up a scarecrow in his cornfield. Lately, his corn had been feeding more crows than people, and Mr. Johnson had enough of that for sure. He managed to scrounge up a sack of hay, an old fabric shirt with a red tie, an old wooden ball, and some brown pants. He stuffed the hay into the clothing and tied it all together. Then, using the ball for a head, he made a right good scarecrow. After that, he scribbled a face on the ball and propped the whole thing up in his cornfield.
"I hope this will keep those darn crows away from my field,"
he said as he looked over his creation with pride. It was then that he heard something, a very faint crying that seemed to be coming from the direction of the woods in the distance. He called out in that direction,
"Hello? Is anyone there?"
There was no response, but the crying seemed to stop. Mr. Johnson waited a while and then turned to walk towards his barn. But as he did, the crying continued, and he turned around to call out again. Before he could utter a word, the crying turned into a screaming fit.
"Where is my son?"
"Is anyone out there?"
he called out, but no one replied. Mr. Johnson began walking in the direction of the woods, and after a while found himself deep within. When he could find nobody in sight, he decided to head back up to his farm.
"If you don't give me back my baby, I will kill you."
"I don't have your baby. I'm just an innocent man. Please let me go,"
the man pleaded. Then he heard a gunshot in the distance.
"Oh God, I've got to get out of here,"
he said to himself as he began running out of the woods. As he made it to the edge of his farm, something slimy broke through the ground and grabbed his leg. Mr. Johnson screamed as he'd never screamed before and struggled against whatever had grabbed him with all his might. But it was no use, and he was dragged beneath the ground. That afternoon, his wife came out to fetch Mr. Johnson for lunch, but could not find him anywhere. As she made her way to the field, she noticed the scarecrow that he had erected that morning. But there was something odd about it. It seemed to be leaning over and pointing at something. It was then that Mrs. Johnson saw her husband's hand reaching up out of the ground, and next to that, the rest of him. Mrs. Johnson stood in her backyard, burying what remained of her husband. She put him in the corner of the yard next to an old oak tree. The tree had been planted by her great-grandmother 29 years earlier. As she finished filling up the shallow grave, Mrs. Johnson thought back to her great-grandmother's words from the very day the tree was planted. "Darla, my love, this tree I plant here today shall be your guidance and always keep you safe from harm. It will stand as a symbol of protection for you and your family, as a reminder that I am always with you." After Mr. Johnson was buried, she said a prayer for him and went inside. Later that night, she lay tossing and turning in her bed at the memory of the horror which she had witnessed that day. What kind of monstrosity could do such a thing? She asked herself. It was then that she heard footsteps coming up the stairs. The footsteps came slowly through the hallway and stopped outside her door. Mrs. Johnson lay perfectly still and listened. She then heard a strange breathing outside her door, as though some animal were searching for food. She gently sat up on her bed, shaking in fear, and staring at the door as the knob turned and the door slowly began to creak open. When the door opened fully, there stood what appeared to be a woman in a black torn skirt. "Who are you?" cried Mrs. Johnson, staring fearfully into the woman's eyes.
"Where is my son?"
answered the woman in a deep, frightening voice. Mrs. Johnson froze there in terror and was unable to speak.
"Where have you taken my baby?"
the woman cried out. Mrs. Johnson sat still for a moment before she finally answered. "Please don't hurt me. If I give you your son, will you let me go?"
"Yes,"
answered the woman.
"I will."
Mrs. Johnson pointed her finger across the room towards a small storage room. "He's in there." The woman slowly creeped over to the storage room and grabbed the doorknob. Mrs. Johnson quickly ran as fast as she could and sprinted out the back door. She ran across the yard and hid behind a tree, watching for the strange woman to come back out of the house.
Give me back my baby,
Came a thundering shout as Mrs. Johnson saw the woman burst through the bedroom window. The figure flew through the air and landed on the ground, seemingly unharmed and breathing heavily with anger. Mrs. Johnson stood horrified and then noticed that the tree she was hiding behind was her great-grandmother's oak tree. The frightening woman then spotted her and began to glide towards the oak tree, wailing in anger.
You shall die,
she shouted. Mrs. Johnson slowly closed her eyes and waited for her certain demise, when a hand suddenly came bursting out of the ground and grabbed the woman by the leg. It then began pulling her into the ground. The woman screamed out in distress and began flailing her arms in desperation. She then let out one final scream and disappeared into the ground. After the woman was gone, Mrs. Johnson sat on the ground, exhausted. "Thank you, great-grandmother," she said with a sigh of relief. "This is finally over."